What does it take to be happy in life? Most assume it's a matter of good genes, money, or just plain luck. Not so, according to eminent psychologist Martin Seligman. He's been called the father of the positive psychology movement. In his new book, he looks at the surprising ways we can boost our own happiness simply by using the strengths we already have. It's called Authentic Happiness. When most of us think of happiness, we think about the circumstance we find ourselves in, whether we're wealthy or healthy or good-looking, or even lucky. Your research suggests that happiness is a function of something quite different.
It's astonishing how wrong our common sense is about happiness and how badly we've needed a science of happiness. Externals turn out to make almost no difference. So people thought that wealth made a difference to life satisfaction. Well, it turns out if you look at between countries, you look at Mexico, Brazil, Switzerland, if you're extremely poor, Sierra Leone, the life satisfaction of people in Sierra Leone is different from people in Mexico or Sweden. But once you're above a low safety net, there's almost not a dime's worth of difference with wealth. People said climate, that people in San Diego would be happier than people in Toronto. Climate doesn't matter at all. People said physical health. There's something from the outside. It turns out physically healthy people are not happier than physically unhealthy people. You basically have to have two lethal illnesses going on at once before you get noticeably unhappier. Lottery winners, they get happy for about 3 months. Within a year, they're back down to their baseline. On the other side, paraplegics, after the accident, 6 months of misery. By a year, they're just as happy as they were before.
So what do these happy people have in common?
Well, it looks like for one form of happiness, the pleasant life, we've got something like a set range. And positive affectivity, which is the jargon for the pleasant life, ebullience, good cheer, giggliness, and it's usually what people mean, quite mistakenly, by happiness, is highly heritable. Identical twins reared separately are in roughly the same place at it. So we seem to, what people have in common is a biologically given range of happiness. But what has been discovered is you can either live in the bottom part of that range or at the top part of that range. And there are techniques for living in the top part of that range.
Before we get there, I want to stop just for a second because the book is called Authentic Happiness. And so we're not just talking about chuckling and laughing all the time. In fact, you say something that's very interesting. You say that positive emotions alienated from character can lead to emptiness. What does that mean?
Well, I think a lot of people who lead lives in which they pursue as much pleasure as possible end up with this feeling that they're fidgeting unto death. And where does that come from? Well, for me, it comes from three different kinds of happiness, three different routes to life satisfaction. The pleasant life, which has shortcuts to it, and which very often leads to the fidgeting unto death problem. The good life, what Aristotle was after, eudaimonia, which is a life of probably, this is the first time we've met, Alan, but I would judge that you may fit into this, and that's a life of absorption, immersion, complete flow. And in the state of flow, time stops for you, you're completely absorbed, you're completely immersed, and most importantly, you feel nothing. You think nothing. You're one with the music, one with the crystal, one with the book. Notice the complete difference between the pleasures, like orgasm and chocolate, and flow. One has feelings, the other only in retrospect when it's over you say, wow, that was fun. And these are two different kinds of lives, and it turned out probably that people who are very high on the giggle, the Debbie Reynolds, the ebullient side of life, don't get flow as easily, and people who are high flow people don't get these raw feels very easily. Usually we've consigned the high flow people to the hell of unhappiness, but they don't belong there at all. This kind of absorption in life is one of the three major routes to life satisfaction.
Well, you talk about these three paths, and the pleasant life and the good life. Let's talk about the third then, the meaningful life. How does that differ?
Well, the third is the meaningful life. And I think when you find people who have pleasant lives, and the lucky people have both pleasant lives and immersion, that you can still feel you're fidgeting unto death. Because as a species, we're a meaning-seeking species. It's ineluctable about it. It's something we don't understand, but we are that. And meaning has to do with using your highest strengths in the service of something larger than you are. And there are very many people who find meaningful lives, find life satisfaction in meaning, who are low on immersion and low on pleasure. And I think it's important, since we are such different creatures, to understand that a life worth living, a happy life, can come in any of these three ways.
Talk to me about these signature strengths. You say we all have the part of core virtues that are related to our character. Tell me about them, how we discover them. I mean, you've talked in the book, you give tests. Give our audience some sense of how they might ferret these out.
There seem to be 6 virtues that are consensually agreed on across 4,000 years and across virtually every culture. Wisdom and knowledge is one. Humanity, love, kindness, justice, courage, temperance, and spirituality. So we've created a way of diagnosing these. We've created a test for it, which any one of your audience can take for free on the website. Everyone says it's fun to take. It's a 25-minute test. The website's www.authentichappiness.org. And what you come out with is what are the 5 highest strengths in your life. And many thousands of people have now taken this, so we have good validity about it. And then you look at this list, and usually people find 3 or 4 of them they recognize. So I recognized the love of learning. That one didn't surprise me. And I recognized curiosity. That didn't surprise me. I was really surprised that leadership was one of my strengths. And so you look at your 5 strengths and you ask, of these 5, which of these do you own? Which of these are really you?
These are the signatures.
These are the which of these, when you use them, do you feel invigorated? So right now, for example, we're calling on one of my signature strengths, which is love of learning and love of teaching. Having this conversation with you, Alan, does not drain me. I'm going to go away from it invigorated. On the other hand, if you and I were sitting down and we're going to have a committee report in which I had to lead the committee, I know how to do that kind of thing, but when it was over, I'd want to drink.
No joy, there'd be no happiness.
Right. Well, and I feel drained. So the signature strengths are the try and stop me strengths. Everyone's got 4 or 5 of them. The first important thing is to know what they are, and now we have an aid, a questionnaire that can help you with that. And then the next part is the downhill skiing part, and that's saying, fairness is a signature strength of yours. Kindness is a signature strength of yours. Now, how can you recraft your life? How can you change your work? How can you change the way you interact with the people you love so that fairness and kindness play a larger role than they do? How can you use it every day?
The work, again, you say the key is not finding the perfect job, seeking the perfect job out there, but trying to find one that really allows you to do it better than others by tapping into these strengths. Again, give us an example of that.
Well, let's take hospital orderlies, which probably seems to most of your audience a pretty miserable job. It turns out there are 2 kinds of hospital orderlies. They have the same physical job, they empty bedpans. One kind sees it as a job, something they do for money, something when the money stops, they're going to stop doing it. They can't wait to retire. There's another kind who see it as a calling. Religious word, vocation is the right word for this. They see themselves as part of the healthcare system, and their job is to make life better for the patients and to free up more time for the nurses and the doctors. What they do, besides emptying bedpans, is they go home and they get pictures and they put them up on the walls of comatose patients, bring in flowers. So if that person wakes up, the first thing they'll see is something beautiful. And when you look at how happy these people are, that is, these orderlies are, how loyal they are to the job, retention, these are the people you want. The same is true of secretaries. Just consider hairdressers for a moment, which when I was a kid was something mechanical job about cutting your hair. Now it's a job about self-disclosure, about gossip, about knowledge and the like. Hairdressers have recrafted their profession. Kitchen workers have recrafted their profession to take it from boiling potatoes to culinary artistry. And so that's an example of turning work into something like a calling by using your signature strengths, by knowing what they are and deploying them.
You are a pioneer in what is called the positive psychology movement. Tell us, how different is that from our traditional notion of psychology and what psychologists traditionally do?
Well, I was also part of the tradition. So for 30 years, I did trauma, helplessness, depression, the negative emotions, and how to relieve them. And then I found myself the president of the American Psychological Association. And I thought what I should do is ask, what's wrong with psychology? And when I looked around, I found a 100-to-1 ratio on the number of articles about depression and the number of the science about happiness. And so it seemed to me very important, particularly in a time of wealth, a time of prosperity, that the part of psychology that's been unbaked, the part about what are the best things in life, what takes life beyond going from -8 to -2. When we lie awake at night, we're often thinking about how do we go from +2 to +5 in our lives. So 5 years ago, I acquired the mission of asking the question and trying to support the science of what are the positive emotions, how do we build them, what are the strengths and virtues, how do we build those, and what are the positive institutions, and how do we build those?
But at the risk of alienating the profession even more, I mean, you have gone as far as saying that a lot of cognitive therapy, a lot of psychotherapy that does dwell on people's problems can actually have a negative effect. In some instances, it can do more harm than good.
No, I don't think I'd say that. So I've spent the bulk of my life working on depression, suicide, helplessness, and there, both the cognitive therapies and the drugs are good palliatives, and in the case of cognitive therapy, sometimes even curative.
Right.
So
but that's in cases where there's diagnosable mental illness.
Of severe, difficult depression. The voyage out of depression and the voyage into happiness are not reciprocal. This is one of the common sense fallacies. So what we used to think was that if I can get rid of my depression, if I can get rid of my anxiety, if I can get rid of my anger, then somehow I'm going to become a happy, exemplary human being. Well, the answer is when you get rid of those things, you get to 0. In fact, that's the best. Any therapeutic program that has its aim getting rid of what's bad, the best you can ever do is 0. But it turns out being happy, having a pleasant life, having a good life, having a meaningful life, are not remotely guaranteed by being depression-free or anxiety-free. It's a completely different system. It has a different evolutionary function, and there are different techniques that bring happiness about. Why did Eleanor Roosevelt devote her life to helping black people and poor people? The typical social science answer was to compensate for her mother's narcissism and to compensate for her father's alcoholism. It does not remotely occur to my history, English, political science, Freudian colleagues that maybe deep down, right at base, Eleanor Roosevelt was pursuing virtue. So the first premise of traditional psychology that I think is mistaken is that the positives are somehow reducible to the negatives.
The reaction to the negative, the
Right,
to compensate or
parasitic
overcome.
upon.
Right.
There's every reason to think these are two separate systems which engage in different ways. And the second, I guess I'll go as far as saying fallacy of the traditions, is that we're prisoners of the past, we're prisoners of our childhood. And that somehow this conversation we're having, my interest in positive psychology, your intellectualism, is somehow dictated by unresolved problems about childhood sexuality. Yeah,
right.
And it turns out people in the last 20 years have looked very carefully in solid scientific ways at the influence of childhood on adults. And one kind of study you do is you take every pair of identical twins in Virginia. They're genetically the same, and you look at them as adults, and you look at, say, childhood depression, adult depression, or adult sexual problems, and you ask, to what extent was that a function of their genes? To what extent was a function of childhood trauma, parental warmth, recent bad events, and the like? You find a minimal contribution of childhood events, strong contribution of genetics, strong contribution of recent events.
If I want to seek authentic happiness, does that mean that the first thing I really have to do is kind of overcome this societal obsession with how I feel?
No, I don't think so. I think the first thing you have to do is give up the notion that life is about correcting your weaknesses. I'm not big on correcting weaknesses. My penmanship's awful. It's always been awful. No one could correct it. And I have lots of weaknesses, so do you. But the reason we're sitting across the table from each other in this elevated environment is not because we corrected any weaknesses that we have. It's because we recognized in ourselves we had certain strengths. We named them, we learned to run with them. We use them to buffer us against the vicissitudes that come our way. So I think the first thing, and maybe the only thing you have to give up, is not the obsession with how you feel. That's a reasonably good thing to give up. But rather the notion, work on your weaknesses. Get rid of your weaknesses.
Last thing I want to touch on, I mean, your research and all kinds of other researchers has shown time and time again that the happiest single cohort in society are religious people, people who believe, who have a sense of faith. When so many in modern society have difficulty with the non-rational side of religious dogma, I mean, can you get that same happiness that people who have faith in religions do if you're an agnostic or an atheist?
Well, let me first correct what you said. Statistically, religious people are happier than non-religious people. It would be an overstatement to say that the happiest people on the face of the earth. That's probably not so, but it does give people an edge. The third great route to happiness is the use of your signature strengths in the service and being part of something much larger than you. And the larger that thing is, the more meaning it brings. Now, there are plenty of things in secular life that are not supernatural, that are much larger than we are. It's very hard for stamp collectors or bridge players using their signature strengths in essentially solipsistic pursuits to have the kind of happiness that people with a meaningful life has. Politics, helping other people, charity, being part of technology. If we take onto ourselves, if we make the choices in life about aligning ourselves with an increase in knowledge, an increase in power, an increase in goodness, without any belief in supernatural, we are on the same path that religious people have.
On that optimistic note, Martin Seligman, I want to thank you very much for joining me. It's a true pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.